So our next subject is avoiding flicker in the lights. Here are some shots I did in Japan and in the UK. And if you've ever traveled outside of your country, you may have encountered this: lights that flicker. Lights all around us are flickering all the time, and you see it a lot if you're shooting in slow motion or high frame rates in another country. Now usually the lights are in sync with your camera, so we don't see the flicker. So why do we see the flicker if we go abroad? In the USA, when you plug in a light, the power grid supplies AC power, or alternating current, and it's supplied at 60 Hz cycles. What it means is the power does this: it creates a sine wave, and it does this at 60 times a second. What this is the power increases, and then it drops, then it decreases again, but in the opposite direction. And it does this 60 times a second, meaning 60 Hz. So it's hitting its max power twice in every cycle. So 2 of these peaks is 1 cycle. So we have 120 of these peaks every second. So if I'm shooting in 30 frames per second, each frame will capture exactly 4 sets of peaks in every frame. And we get that by 120 peaks per cycle divided by 30 frames per second equals 4. Even if you shoot at 60 frames per second, they'll still line up with the peaks. So you shouldn't see any flickering. We have 120 peaks per cycle. We divide that by 60 frames per second. So 120 divided by 60 equals 2. So everything lines up. The problem comes when we go to other countries and their electricity supply is at 50 Hz. So 50 times a second. Most of Europe and Asia run on 50 Hz. Canada, USA, and Mexico, and most of Central America run on 60 Hz. So now if the place I'm in runs on 50 Hz, and I try to shoot my video with my 30 frames per second, I have 50 cycles per second, or 100 pulses per second. And that's 100 peaks per second divided by 30 will give me 3.33. So now they'll be landing on different places on the power cycle, and they don't line up or in sync anymore, meaning I'm not in sync with the light source of the local supply. And that's why we see flicker in the lights. So you might think that if you're in a 50 Hz country like the UK, all you have to do is shoot at 25 frames per second or 50 frames per second. Well, you could do this and it's perfectly fine. And let's say you do this, but you play it back in the USA at 24 frames per second, which would mean it would play 4% slower, but that wouldn't be noticeable and it should be fine. But you don't have to do that. You can still keep your 30 frames per second if you change your shutter speed. As long as you change either the frame rate or your shutter speed, you're fine. As long as one of these things, your frame rate or shutter, is in sync with the lighting, you'll be good. So to keep it simple, I could keep the 30 frames per second, and instead of changing my shutter to 1/60, which I normally would do, I would change my shutter to 1/50, and that would sync up my camera to the local 50 Hz cycle. Same for people coming from 50 Hz region to a 60 Hz region like the USA. You can keep your 25 frames per second or 100 frames per second and change your shutter speed so that there isn't any flicker on the lights as seen on the camera. If you're from a 60 Hz region and go to a 50 Hz region, set your shutter to 1/50 or 1/100, and this matches the local power supply for the country that you're in. You don't have to change your frame rate. Just change your shutter slightly so it matches your local power cycle. You might be asking yourself about 24 frames per second, that cinematic frame rate. Well, 24 times 5 goes into 120, so that it's in sync with 60 Hz countries, so that's fine. And if you're in a 50 Hz cycle area, just set your shutter to 1/50 and you'll be fine. And there you go. It's much easier to eliminate flickering camera than trying to remove it later on in post-editing. Okay, that's all done, and I'll see you in the next lesson.